Readers and friends. Today is Wednesday, May 25th, 2022, and May is Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month. I was born in Kobe, Japan, where my mother was raised. Oahu was where my father grew up in a family of Japanese heritage. I've been giving some thought to which of my life experiences that were rooted in my ethnicity or race might be something to share with you here. My dad was a career Army, so we moved regularly through my childhood, and every Army brat knows what I'm talking about. Today's recollection centers in a moment just as our family was returning to the States in the early 1960s. My father loved his navy blue 1958 Peugeot 403. I loved to roll the numbers around my mouth. Quets en toi. I was not surprised that he would choose to ship the car across the Atlantic. After 4 years, his posting at the Boussac Army Base in southwest France had ended, and our family was returning to the States. We were reunited with the Peugeot at New York Harbor. My father watched anxiously as it was hoisted from the ship's hold, lowered gently onto the tarmac, unhooked, netting removed, and his keys given back to him. His plan was to drive across the southern part of the States to the Presidio of San Francisco. There he would retire after 20 years in the Army, and my mother would finally be able to live with a large Japanese community around her. We were a family of 5 in a foreign car, driving nonchalantly to the south. Of the 5 of us, only my mother was not an American citizen. As our father's children, my siblings and I were automatically U.S. citizens. From my vantage point sitting in the back seat behind my mother, I could see my dad maneuver his beloved Peugeot down the coast to the southern states. My mother was happy my dad was retiring, and my dad was happy because he got to drive his car. I was a few months shy of my 13th birthday. I felt a great sadness leaving France, my friends and neighbors, and the safety of our home in a vast vineyard which adjoined a wild forest in the back of Beyond, my favorite place to be free. The cafe was on the main street. It was a narrow, ordinary building with a large picture window facing traffic and the sidewalk. The linoleum floors, once white, were a dingy gray. There were faded metal signs advertising cigarettes, hamburgers, and fries. A homemade sign touted fresh apple and peach pies and all-you-could-drink coffee. To the right of the kitchen divider was a crookedly hung sign that advertised breakfast served all day. A waitress held court behind a long counter lined with a dozen stools. Behind her, the short order cook leaned at the pass-through divider, hands splayed on his delivery counter, waiting for orders. The half-dozen or so booths near the window were maroon but naugahyde. The restaurant was empty except for the cook, the waitress, and 2 other people. We walked in like ducklings, my dad in the lead towards one of the empty booths. I followed. I was gawky with thick bangs and pigtails. My brother marched behind me, his dark, thick-cut hair as short as my father's. My mother brought up the rear, holding my 4-year-old sister's hand. Even at a young age, I could tell the aging waitress behind the counter had dyed her bouffant-styled hair. The brassy blonde dew reminded me of the dry hay that Monsieur, our French landlord, fed their horse, Muto. Her black Cleopatra eyeliner was applied with a heavy hand, and a cigarette protruded from the corner of her smoker's lips, bleeding into cheap red lipstick. Seated at the counter in front of the waitress was an officer of the law. I don't know if he was a policeman, sheriff, or highway patrol. He was in uniform, a cup of black coffee in front of him, ashtray filled with cigarette butts. The customer, a civilian, was hunched over his pie and coffee, a cigarette smoldering in another ashtray. He was in dirty bib overalls, a once white t-shirt, underarms brown with sweat and dirt, topped by a greasy baseball cap perched on his bald head. No one spoke. The waitress made eye contact with the officer of the law, who thoughtlessly shrugged a shoulder. His silent support was enough to encourage the waitress, who flicked her head towards the front door we just entered. We locked eyes for just a moment before she laid down the law. Righteously, her harsh voice decreed, "We only serve white folks here." My mother had enough English to understand what the waitress said. In southwest France, where we had lived for the past 4 years, there had been no color line. It was a shock to her. Quickly and quietly she spoke in Japanese to my father, encouraging him to leave immediately. My brother didn't understand the situation. Comically almost, he stomped his feet, declaring that he was hungry. I totally understood what the waitress had said. I had caught the derision and hate in her tone, could feel her mocking us, her ego swelling with pride as the white man silently egged her on. My father was furious. His jaws were locked, his teeth clenched as he took my hand and my brother's. My mother was already headed towards the front door. Wordlessly, we climbed into our respective seats in the welcoming Peugeot. My mother sobbed silently. My baby sister followed with wailing. My brother was petulant for a lost breakfast. Sitting behind my mother, I did not weep. I observed my father as he tapped his keys on the steering wheel. Rolling down his window, he chain-smoked several unfiltered Chesterfields. I think we understood exactly what had happened and why. We sat in the Peugeot for what seemed like ages. The low hum of the black and white clock on the dashboard competed with the muffled early spring rain outside. In my mother's arms, my baby sister had fallen asleep, drawing comfort by sucking her tiny right thumb. Sighing unhappily, my brother grumbled, "I'll probably starve to death." No one hushed him. Although we were huddled in a small space, each of us was isolated in our own world. After a while, the energy moved within the car as my mother quietly addressed my dad with an unfamiliar diminutive, "Yo-chan." He flicked a butt out the window and looked over at my mother, who had dried her tears. Determination and dignity etched her soft features. My dad met her gaze. Still baffled by my mother's endearment, I witnessed a silent negotiation between my parents that declared connection and family. I'm sure it only took a few seconds, but for me it was an eternity. Never before had I observed this level of intimacy between my parents. My mother was the disciplinarian, and all things related to our family were decided by her. My dad simply acquiesced. He started the car and swung into the gas station next door to the diner. He silently dug through the car trunk, and we all recognized the garment bag that held his carefully hung army uniform. He disappeared into the service station's bathroom. My mother and I sat patiently. My brother fidgeted. My baby sister slept. My father reappeared dressed in his dark green uniform with his medals. I always remembered my dad with that thick gray hair covering his matched garrison cap. My mother cleared her throat as he climbed back into the Peugeot. A smile spread across his face, and I smiled too. We were going back. My father was not going to allow this to happen to us. We would eat breakfast this morning. A few minutes later, my father, bigger than life, stood framed in the cafe's doorway. Back ramrod straight, he was tall and proud in his army dress uniform. The tableau of four inside had not changed. The yellow-haired waitress with the cigarette lips choked on her smoke. The uniformed police, sheriff, highway patrol officer respectfully tipped his head. The older man next to him grunted. The cook still sprawled at the kitchen divider. The waitress regarded the men at the counter. They did not meet her eyes, nor give her any direction. Confused, she grabbed two menus and began to lead us towards the back of the restaurant. My father held his ground and did not follow. Standing next to the men at the counter, he wordlessly pointed to the booth across the aisle nearest them. The waitress, red-faced, conceded. She gave my father a menu, placing the other one in front of my mother, who was settling my sister next to her. My mother, who read no English, slid the menu across to me as I was sitting next to my dad. In Jackson, Mississippi, in March 1961, a Japanese-American family with a war veteran dad ate breakfast at a diner that I'm sure has long since been razed for progress. My brother stuffed himself with pancakes and scrambled eggs. I begged coffee from my dad, who winked and slid me his cup, ignoring my mother's objections. Afterwards, back in the Peugeot, my brother moaned and complained that he ate too much. My mother looked out the window, content. My dad adjusted the rearview mirror, turned the ignition, and we drove away from that cafe. Thank you for joining me today. I cherish having this time to share a little beyond what's beyond the covers of my books, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. There's information in the description about how to send me a note, or just leave a comment on the video here if you'd rather. AC will make sure I see it. And I'm going to ask a favor of you. If you'll just think of one new person who has not found us yet and pass along my YouTube link, that will help more than you can imagine. Plus, remember that YouTube counts everything. So if you'll give this video a thumbs up and click that red subscribe button, thank you. We always welcome new readers as well. A personal recommendation from a friend is the best introduction to a writer. Please help us spread the word. The address of my Amazon page is in the description below. All the Walkerville books are available to purchase on both Kindle and print editions. And you'll find the direct link for next Wednesday's live chat there as well. Hope to see you then, and again, thank you so much for joining us.